The defendant is guilty of first-degree murder. Mrs. Adelson, control yourself.
Friday, July 18th, 2014. Just after 11 a.m. in Benton Hills, a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood in Tallahassee, Florida. The kind of place with manicured lawns and longtime neighbors who wave at each other from their driveways. Dan Markel is on the phone with a friend. He's pulling into his own driveway, mid-conversation. Nothing unusual about the morning. He's just come from the gym. His 2 sons are already dropped off at daycare. It's a Friday. It should have been an easy day, the kind that blurs into every other day in a person's memory. Then his voice changes. There's someone in my driveway. I don't recognize them. That's the last full sentence his friend on the phone ever hears him say. Then a grunt, muffled sound, labored breathing, then nothing at all. Across the street, a neighbor named James Geiger hears a loud bang. He looks out his window in time to see a metallic Toyota Prius reversing hard out of Markel's driveway and speeding off down the quiet residential street. Concerned, thinking maybe it's a break-in, Geiger walks over to check. The garage door is up. A car engine is still running. And inside it, in the driver's seat, is a man who is barely alive. He calls 911. We heard a loud bang and a car pulled away from next door. I thought the gentleman was backing out and I went back in the house, but he never backed out. His driver's side window was shattered and he was battered and he can't answer. He's inside. I don't know if somebody tried to shoot him or if he shot himself. I don't know. Dan Markel, Harvard-educated law professor, father of 2 young boys, has been shot twice in the head at close range, sitting in his own car, in his own driveway, in broad daylight, on an ordinary Friday morning. He'll be rushed to the hospital. He will not survive the night. Everyone in this neighborhood will tell police the same thing over and over in the days that follow. Dan Markel didn't have enemies. He didn't have debts. Nothing was stolen. There was no reason for this. It reads, at first glance, like a robbery gone catastrophically wrong, a random, senseless act of violence with no target behind it. It would take investigators more than 11 years. 5 separate criminal trials, 1 FBI sting operation disguised as a shakedown, and 1 75-year-old grandmother caught at Miami International Airport with a one-way ticket out of the country to find out exactly why Dan Markel had to die. This is the story of how a custody dispute over 2 little boys, a dispute that, on paper, was nothing more than a bitter divorce and a few hundred miles of geography, turned into a murder-for-hire conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of a wealthy South Florida family, and how a coded word for murder, hidden inside a joke about a broken television, would end up sitting in a police interrogation room less than 24 hours after the killing, in plain sight and completely misunderstood for years. Before we get into how this all unravels, the family behind it, the coded messages, the sting operation that finally cracked it open. If you're new to this channel, consider subscribing. We cover cases like this every week, the ones where the truth takes years and unbelievable turns to surface. And if you've got thoughts on where this story is headed, drop them in the comments section. Daniel Eric Markel was born in Montreal in October 1972 and raised in Toronto in a close, religious Jewish family, the son of Ruth and Phil, brother to Shelley. From the time he was young, the people around him reached for the same word to describe him: energetic, not restless, not scattered, driven in a way that was obvious even as a kid. By high school, that drive had a direction, and it was pointed squarely at the United States and at the kind of academic career most people only imagine from the outside. He got into Harvard as an undergraduate, studying politics and philosophy, and graduated magna cum laude. In between his undergraduate years in law school, he spent time on a Doro Fellowship in Israel, studying at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and picked up a master's degree in political theory from Emmanuel College at Cambridge. He graduated from Harvard Law School in 2001, magna cum laude. From there, he clerked for Judge Michael Daley Hawkins on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, one of the more prestigious clerkships a young lawyer can land, and then went into white-collar criminal defense at a firm in Washington, D.C., where, among other things, he helped represent a group of law professors arguing against the use of public shaming as criminal punishment in a case before the Ninth Circuit. Even early in his career, the through line of his intellectual life was already visible. He was fascinated by punishment, why we punish people, how much, and what it's supposed to accomplish. Then, in 2005, at 32 years old, he joined the faculty at Florida State University's College of Law, holding the DeLembert Professorship. This is where he was supposed to be. This is where he built his life's work. At FSU, Dan Markel became the kind of academic other scholars talked about, with a mix of admiration and mild disbelief. He was relentlessly prolific, publishing extensively on retribution and punishment theory, the ethics and mechanics of how the criminal justice system decides what people deserve. He co-founded Prof's Blog, which became one of the most widely read legal blogs in the country, a place where serious legal debate happened in near real time, outside the slow grind of academic journals, with Markel functioning as something like its intellectual center of gravity. Colleagues who knew him described someone who could pull an entire room of skeptical law professors into a genuinely engaged debate, someone whose energy was contagious rather than exhausting. And it was around the same period that Dan met a woman through, of all things, a Jewish dating platform called JDate. Her name was Wendy Adelson. She was 7 years younger than Dan and came from her own version of a prosperous, tightly bonded Jewish family. Her parents ran a successful dental practice in Tamarack, Florida. Wendy was finishing up a law degree at the University of Miami and held a master's in international relations from Cambridge in her own right. On paper, they were an obvious match. Two brilliant, ambitious people from similar backgrounds, both drawn to law, both academically accomplished well beyond what's typical even among lawyers. On February 26, 2006, they married in a lavish ceremony in Boca Raton. Announced in the New York Times, the kind of wedding write-up that signals two families with real money and real status coming together. Wendy moved to Tallahassee to be with Dan. She joined the FSU law faculty herself, focusing her academic work on human trafficking law and advocacy for trafficking victims. In 2009, their first son, Benjamin, was born. Their second son, Lincoln, followed in 2010. From the outside, this looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. Two accomplished law professors, two young sons, tenure-track careers, a beautiful home in a good neighborhood. The kind of life most people spend decades of effort trying to build, and most never fully get. But underneath all of it, there was a problem that had never really been resolved. And it had nothing to do with money, or infidelity, or any of the more familiar reasons a marriage like this comes apart. It had to do with geography, and just how far one family was willing to go to fix it. Wendy Adelson had never been happy in Tallahassee. By most accounts from people close to her, she found it small, provincial, isolating. A 5-hour drive from the South Florida world she'd grown up inside, from her parents, from the social and professional network she'd built her whole identity around. That distance gnawed at her for years of the marriage, according to friends and family who later testified or spoke publicly about the relationship. In September 2012, while Dan was away on a business trip, Wendy packed up the marital home, the furniture, the contents of their joint safety deposit box, their two young sons, then 5 and 3. She left no note explaining where she'd gone, or when, or whether. She planned to come back. Dan came home to an empty house and divorce papers waiting for him on the bed. He would later describe the moment to friends using one specific phrase, one that stuck with everyone who heard him say it: his Pearl Harbor. A surprise attack, with no warning and no negotiation beforehand, just an empty house and legal paperwork where his family used to be. For weeks, he didn't even know where his own children were being kept. He eventually learned Wendy had taken Benjamin and Lincoln to her parents' home in Coral Springs, more than 500 miles south, and had no intention of returning to Tallahassee. She filed for divorce that same month, formally beginning what would become one of the more consequential custody battles in recent Florida legal history, though almost nobody would have described it that way at the time. Here is the detail that would end up mattering more than anyone in the Adelson family seemed to anticipate. Dan Markel was a lawyer, and not an inexperienced one. He fought back through the family court system, hard, and Florida family law gave him real, enforceable leverage. As long as Dan remained an active, legally recognized co-parent with custodial rights registered in Leon County, the children were legally tethered, at least part-time, to Tallahassee. Wendy could move to Coral Springs if she wanted to. Her sons, for the most part, could not without violating a custody order that Dan had every legal right and every personal motivation to enforce. For the Adelson family, a family used to being able to solve problems with money, connections, and control, this was intolerable. Dan Markel's custody rights had effectively become the one structural obstacle standing between Wendy, her parents, and the life in South Florida they all wanted for her and the boys. At one point during this period, the family reportedly attempted to simply purchase the problem away, offering Dan a financial settlement in exchange for relinquishing full custody. He refused. His sons were not something he was willing to negotiate away, no matter what was offered. And there was something else happening in Dan's life during this same window that mattered, even though almost no one who knew about it understood its significance at the time. He was moving on. He'd started a new relationship, and the people around him noticed the change in him almost immediately. The energy coming back, the sense of a man rebuilding rather than just surviving. You have a girlfriend now. You're having fun in life again. You're smiling a lot, one friend recalled telling him during this period. You have to start celebrating those things and walk away from this negativity. He was, by every account, doing exactly that. He had no idea what was already quietly being set in motion against him, hundreds of miles away, inside a family that had decided the custody order simply needed to disappear, along with the man who held it. Fast forward nearly 2 years, to that Friday morning in July 2014, Dan Markel woke up in his Benton Hills home, got his 2 sons ready, and drove them to daycare, dropping them off just before 9 a.m., a completely ordinary start to what should have been a completely ordinary day. From there, he drove to Premier Health and Fitness Center on Miccosukee Boulevard for his regular workout, part of a routine his neighbors and colleagues could have described to police almost without thinking, because it was that consistent. What Dan didn't know, what nobody around him knew, was that he wasn't alone that morning. Surveillance footage, later pulled from the gym itself and from cameras mounted on city buses along his usual route, would show a green Toyota Prius arriving in the same window that he did, not idling nearby, following him in. At 10:38 a.m., Dan left the gym and started driving home toward Thomasville Road. The Prius followed. Multiple traffic and municipal cameras along the way tracked both vehicles moving through the neighborhood in the same direction, at the same measured pace. Not the pattern of 2 unrelated drivers who happened to be going the same way, but the pattern of a car deliberately staying close. Around 11 a.m., Dan pulled into his driveway on Trescott Drive. He was on the phone with a friend, describing his morning the way people do on ordinary calls. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. Then his voice changed. He said the words that would end up quoted in police reports and courtroom transcripts for the next 11 years. "Somebody's coming in behind me." Then the grunt his friend heard on the line. Then muffled sounds. Then labored, uneven breathing. Then silence. An autopsy would later confirm Dan had been shot twice at intermediate range, once in the forehead, once in the left cheek, while seated in the driver's seat of his own car, in his own driveway, with the garage door open to the street. The neighbor, James Geiger, heard the shots and looked out in time to see the Prius reversing hard out of Markel's driveway. He walked over, found Dan barely conscious behind the wheel, and called 911. Dan was rushed by ambulance to a local hospital. His 2 sons, Benjamin, 5, and Lincoln, 3, were still at daycare that morning, completely unaware that their father would never come home to pick them up again. He never regained consciousness. On the morning of July 19th, 2014, Dan Markel was declared dead. And approximately 90 minutes after the shooting, before most of Dan's own extended family and colleagues had even been formally notified, cell phone records would later show that one of the men who had been in that Prius made a single phone call. Not to 911, not to a lawyer, not to anyone connected to a robbery or a chance encounter, to a woman named Catherine Magbanua. Tallahassee police opened a homicide investigation within hours of the shooting and had a dedicated tip line running within days. And almost immediately, investigators hit a wall that would define the case for the next 2 years. Dan Markel had no known enemies that anyone, colleagues, friends, family, could immediately point to. Nothing had been taken from the car or the house. This wasn't a robbery, whatever it had first looked like from the 911 call. There was no obvious financial motive, no history of violence connected to him personally, no love triangle, no business dispute, nothing that gave investigators a clear direction to run down. For a law professor who spent his career thinking about punishment and justice, his own death offered almost no evidentiary footing to build a case on. What they did have was the Prius, and it turned out to be more useful than anyone expected in those first weeks. It had been caught on multiple traffic and business security cameras throughout the morning, tracing a path that would eventually be reconstructed almost minute by minute. And it had something else attached to it, a SunPass transponder, Florida's electronic toll payment tag. In 2014, SunPass simply wasn't common in Tallahassee. It was overwhelmingly a South Florida convenience used by commuters running the toll roads around Miami and Fort Lauderdale every single day. That single detail, a toll tag that had no business being in this city, attached to a car that had no business following Dan Markel through his own neighborhood, became the one thread investigators would spend the better part of the next 2 years pulling on, patiently, without a guarantee it would lead anywhere at all. Meanwhile, Wendy Adelson, Dan's ex-wife, was brought in for questioning almost immediately, as any homicide investigation into an ex-spouse's death would require. In that first recorded interview, she expressed grief. And then, without being pushed toward the subject, she brought up her own brother, unprompted. My brother, the one whose name is Charlie, the one I'm really close to. He makes a lot of jokes in bad taste. He said, I looked into hiring a hitman, and it was cheaper to get you this TV, so instead I got you this TV. She was describing, in her own words, what she characterized as a joke. A piece of dark, tasteless family humor her brother had made months earlier about buying her a replacement television instead of hiring someone to kill her ex-husband. She framed it exactly the way most people would frame a bad joke told by a sibling. Embarrassing, insensitive, forgettable. At the time, investigators had no reason to treat it as anything other than what she said it was. It would turn out to be something else entirely. And it would sit, essentially unrecognized for what it was, inside an official police file for nearly 2 years. For close to 2 years, that toll tag was almost the entirety of what investigators had to work with. It took that long. Tracing transponder logs, cross-referencing rental agreements, working through the layers of a car rental company's records, to trace the transponder back to a specific rental transaction out of Miami. The Prius had been rented, and 2 names eventually surfaced attached to that rental: Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera. Investigators located a witness who described a meeting inside a Tallahassee motel room in June 2014, a full month before the murder, during which one of the 2 men was seen holding a revolver consistent with the type of weapon used in the killing. Separately, they pulled ATM surveillance footage, placing one of the men in Pembroke Pines, South Florida, on the day of what turned out to be an earlier reconnaissance trip. Same white long-sleeve shirt, same vehicle, timestamps that lined up, because that's what this turned out to be. Not a single trip north, but 2. The first, running from June 4th through 6th, 2014, was a dry run. Garcia and Rivera drove up from Miami, stayed in motels, studied Dan Markel's daily routine, mapped the roads between his home, his gym, and his son's daycare, and then drove back to South Florida without carrying out the killing. Whether they lost their nerve, weren't given a final order, or were simply gathering information for a later date, investigators never fully established. 6 weeks later, on July 16th and 17th, they came back and finished what they had started. By April 2016, investigators had assembled enough of the picture: the rental records, the surveillance footage, the reconnaissance trip, the witness with the revolver, to know exactly who these 2 men were and to have a working theory of who was standing behind them, financing the entire operation from a safe distance. But knowing wasn't the same as having something a prosecutor could put in front of a jury with confidence. They needed the people at the center of the conspiracy to start talking to each other again, ideally on phones that could be legally monitored. So the FBI built a trap, and it would take the shape of a stranger, a flyer, and a $5,000 number written by hand. Here is what investigators had, by this point, put together in full. The plot to kill Dan Markel didn't come from a stranger, a robber, or anyone with a personal grudge against him individually. It came from inside his ex-wife's own family, the Adelsons of South Florida, a family with money, professional standing, and, according to prosecutors, a controlling internal dynamic that shaped nearly every major decision in Wendy's adult life. At the center of the plot was Charlie Adelson, Wendy's older brother, a periodontist working within his father's dental practice. By late 2013, Charlie had entered into a relationship, on and off, according to later testimony, with a woman named Catherine Magbanua, 30 years old, a mother of two whose children's father, Sigfredo Garcia, carried ties to the Latin Kings gang network in South Florida, along with the kind of operational familiarity someone planning a contract killing might specifically go looking for. The motive that emerged, once investigators reconstructed the full timeline, was almost disorienting in its simplicity. There was no inheritance at stake, no insurance payout, no long simmering feud rooted in some old betrayal. The Adelson family wanted Wendy and her two sons living roughly 500 miles closer to home in Coral Springs, inside the orbit of the family that, according to the lead prosecutor on Donna Adelson's case, Sarah Catherine Dugan, exerted extraordinary control over nearly every aspect of Wendy's life. She was extremely controlling. Dugan told the court, describing Donna Adelson's role. She had very strong opinions about all the decisions in Wendy Adelson's life, whether it be about her career, her relationships, or even purchasing a home. Dan Markel's legally protected custodial rights in Leon County were the one obstacle standing in the way of that relocation. So instead of accepting the existing custody arrangement or continuing to litigate it through the family courts the way divorced parents are supposed to, the family made a different decision: eliminate the obstacle permanently. Charlie brought Magbanua in as an intermediary, the connective layer between the family and the people who would ultimately carry out the killing. Magbanua brought in Garcia, the father of her children. Garcia brought in his close friend, Luis Rivera, an established figure inside the Latin Kings network in North Miami. That's 4 separate layers of distance between the person who wanted Dan dead and the person who actually pulled the trigger. A structure that, whether it was built deliberately with that outcome in mind or not, kept the Adelson family's direct fingerprints as far from the actual crime scene as 4 degrees of separation could manage, and the money moved from the very top of that structure. Donna Adelson, Wendy and Charlie's mother, handled administration for the family's dental practice. Subpoenaed financial records would later reveal 44 separate checks written from the practice's business accounts directly to Catherine Magbanua. No job title existed for her on the company's books. No documented work schedule. No record of any actual role she performed for the practice that would explain the payments. They continued, uninterrupted, until April 2016, nearly 2 full years after the murder, and just as investigators were closing in on Garcia and Rivera. On the night of the killing itself, Magbanua drove to Charlie Adelson's house in South Florida to collect payment. Charlie told her, she would later testify, that her parents had just left the house before she arrived. The cash she was handed was damp, moldy by her account, because Donna Adelson had personally washed the bills before handing them over, an almost surreal detail that would end up repeated in courtroom after courtroom for the next decade. And within the family, this entire conspiracy, the murder of a Harvard-educated law professor, the father of 2 small boys, had its own name. A code word used casually and repeatedly on phone calls for what appears to have been months, if not years, without anyone outside the family recognizing what it actually referred to. They called it the TV. That joke Wendy told police about in her very first recorded interview, less than 24 hours after Dan died. The one about her brother offering to buy her a replacement television instead of hiring a hitman wasn't a coincidence, and on reflection, it wasn't really a joke at all. It was the family's own private shorthand for the murder itself, spoken out loud inside a police interrogation room by the victim's own ex-wife, and it went unrecognized for what it was for the better part of 2 years, a joke about a broken television, sitting in an interrogation room, missed for years. If details like that keep you hooked, this is exactly what the Homicide Room is built for. Subscribe now, because the deeper we go into this case, the darker it gets. By 2016, investigators believed they knew exactly who they were dealing with, from the 2 men in the Prius all the way up to the family financing the operation. What they still lacked was evidence fresh enough and strong enough to bring directly against the Adelsons themselves in a courtroom. So the FBI made a decision: send an undercover agent to approach Donna Adelson directly outside her Miami condominium and see what shook loose. The agent introduced himself as the brother of Luis Rivera, a name Donna would recognize immediately, even if she'd never say so out loud. He handed her a printed news article about Dan Markel's murder, written across it, by hand, in the agent's own writing, a dollar amount, $5,000, and a phone number. "He helped your family with this problem you guys had up north," the agent told her, according to the recorded encounter. "He's going through some rough times, and I want to make sure that you take care of what he's going through, the way you're taking care of Katie and Toto." Donna told the agent she had no idea what he was talking about and walked back inside. But the very first phone call she made after that encounter wasn't to a lawyer, and it wasn't to her husband. It was to her son, Charlie. The next day, Charlie met Catherine Magbanua for lunch at the Dolce Vita restaurant in Miami. Investigators had a recording device in place for the meeting, but the restaurant environment worked against them. Ambient noise, overlapping conversation, voices positioned too close together for the equipment to isolate cleanly. For years, the recording existed, but sat essentially unusable, a piece of evidence prosecutors knew was significant, but couldn't yet put in front of a jury with confidence. It would take 6 full years for audio enhancement technology to catch up to the point where FBI technicians could finally pull the 2 voices apart clearly enough for courtroom use. What the surrounding pattern of phone calls revealed in the meantime: Donna calling Charlie immediately after the street encounter, Charlie calling Magbanua within hours, Magbanua then trying to identify exactly who this mysterious undercover contact even was, calls cycling back and forth through the family for days afterward. Told investigators something important about how comfortable this group had become operating in the open. Comfortable enough to still be referencing a murder in code on phones that weren't encrypted nearly 2 years after the fact. That is not the behavior of people who believe they are in danger of being caught. That is the behavior of people who have calculated, correctly up to that exact moment, that they are already beyond reach. The bump changed that calculation permanently, and it gave investigators the operational momentum they needed to finally start making arrests, after nearly 2 years of following a single toll tag through a wall of silence. May-June 2016, Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera was arrested. Rivera, already serving time on an unrelated racketeering charge, takes a plea deal in October 2016, second-degree murder, 19 years. In exchange for detailed cooperation and testimony, his account lays out the entire operational structure of the plot for investigators. The rented Prius, the motel stays on both trips, the reconnaissance run in early June, the payment chain running back through Magbanua. His understanding of the motive, described in his own words during later testimony, was almost painfully simple. The people who hired them, he said, wanted the lady to get her kids back. He would later state that he had no idea the plan was actually going to end in someone's death. October 2016, Catherine Magbanua is arrested and formally charged with first-degree murder. September 2019, the first trial. Garcia and Magbanua stand together as co-defendants. Prosecutors lay out the full evidentiary picture built over 5 years: phone records, SunPass toll logs, surveillance footage from the gym and city buses, Rivera's detailed cooperating testimony, and the suspicious 44-check payroll trail running out of the Adelson dental practice. Garcia cannot cannot produce a credible account of his own whereabouts on the morning of July 18, 2014. The surveillance and toll evidence placing him in Tallahassee that morning is, in the words of one courtroom observer, essentially impossible to talk around. On October 11th, 2019, the jury convicts Sigfredo Garcia of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. 4 days later, he's sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on the murder charge, plus an additional 30 years for conspiracy. Magbanua's jury, hearing the same evidence, cannot reach a unanimous verdict. 10 jurors for conviction, 2 holding out. Judge James Hankinson declares a mistrial. May 2022. Magbanua faces a second jury nearly 3 years later. This time, Luis Rivera testifies in far greater operational detail than before, who organized the plot from the beginning, exactly how the money moved through the family and back to the men who carried it out, and what was discussed in the days immediately before the killing. On May 27, 2022, this second jury convicts Catherine Magbanua of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation to commit murder. By the end of July, she's been sentenced to life without parole, plus 2 additional 30-year sentences, all ordered to run consecutively, meaning, functionally, she will never leave prison. April 20th, 2022. Nearly 8 years after the murder, Charlie Adelson is finally indicted. He's arrested the following day. His trial doesn't begin until October 23rd, 2023. Prosecutors bring the full accumulated weight of the case against him. Phone records placing him in contact with Magbanua, Garcia, and his own mother throughout the day of the murder. The finally enhanced Dolce Vita restaurant recording from 2016, and Magbanua's own courtroom testimony, repeating under oath the account of that night at Charlie's house that would later become central to his mother's trial as well. On the enhanced Dolce Vita audio, jurors hear Charlie say, "In a moment, prosecutors treat it as close to a confession as the case would produce from his own mouth. If you're going to charge me, charge me. They didn't mention my name, which makes me think these people only know part of the story." On November 6th, 2023, the jury convicts Charlie Adelson on all 3 counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation. On December 12th, he's sentenced to life without parole, plus 60 additional years, 30 each for conspiracy and solicitation, ordered to run one after another. Days after Charlie's verdict, authorities locate Donna Adelson at the airport, still holding that one-way ticket out of the country. She is arrested right at the gate before boarding. Her trial runs from late August through early September 2025, 8 full days of testimony. The jury hears the complete FBI sting recording from 2016. Donna's own panicked voice pleading with a man she believed was a gang member connected to her son's alleged killer for hire, asking to be left alone. They hear Magbanua's testimony again, this time specifically about Donna washing the payment cash. And they hear from women who had been incarcerated alongside both Donna and Magbanua at different points, both of whom testified that Donna had privately admitted her involvement in the plot and had offered compensation in exchange for their silence about what she'd told them. Before sentencing, Donna addresses the court directly. "Never in a million years would I have wanted Danny to be harmed or killed, nor could I ever do anything that would leave these 2 small boys to grow up without him." On September 4th, 2025, 11 years and 47 days after Dan Markel was shot in his own driveway, the jury returns a guilty verdict on all 3 counts against her: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation of murder. On October 13th, 2025, Judge Stephen Everett sentences Donna Adelson to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 30 years to be served consecutively. 5 people, 5 convictions, 11 years, 1 month, and change from the driveway to the final verdict. Of the 5 people convicted in this case, who do you think deserved the harshest sentence, and why? We want to hear your reasoning below. One detail that's come out since Donna Adelson's conviction adds a layer to this story that most true crime coverage never gets to see: what it actually looked like from inside the jury room. Evan Higginbotham, known during the trial only as juror number 6, later spoke publicly about the deliberation process, describing a jury working through 8 days of dense, technical testimony, phone records, financial documents, forensic timelines, before ultimately landing on a unanimous guilty verdict. The prosecution had a long list of evidence, he said in one interview, but I think it was how they presented that evidence in the trial that laid out everything to finally land me a guilty verdict at the end of it. His comments underlined something prosecutors clearly understood going into this final trial, 11 years after the murder. The case against Donna Adelson was never going to rest on one dramatic piece of evidence. It was going to rest on volume, consistency, and a jury willing to sit with all of it for 8 straight days. The jury's foreperson also spoke out publicly after the verdict, discussing the deliberation process in a series of social media posts. A modern footnote to an old-fashioned case built on toll records and phone logs, closed out in an era where jurors process a case, in part, in front of an audience online. Not everyone in the family accepted the verdict quietly. Harvey Adelson, Donna's husband and Charlie and Wendy's father, addressed the court at his wife's sentencing, stating flatly that Donna is innocent, and going further, arguing that a biased judge and jury were influenced by years of one-sided news pieces. Dan Markel's parents, Ruth and Phil, responded publicly to those comments in the days that followed, pushing back on the idea that the outcome had been anything other than the product of 11 years of accumulated evidence and 5 separate juries independently reaching guilty verdicts. Phil Markel, referencing a Jewish tradition of wishing someone a long life, "May you live to 120, turned the blessing pointed and specific when asked about Donna Adelson. I wish her to," a line he let trail into its own implication rather than finishing outright. This case didn't crack because someone had a sudden crisis of conscience, or because one overwhelming piece of evidence surfaced all at once and broke the whole thing open. It came together the way most of the hardest cold cases do, slowly, in fragments, spread out across years, with long stretches where investigators had almost nothing new to work with at all. What's easy to lose, looking back at it now as a finished timeline, is just how much of it depended on things nobody could control or predict. Whether a toll tag happened to still be attached to a rental car 2 years later, whether a man already facing prison time decided cooperation was worth more than loyalty, whether audio technology would ever catch up to a 6-year-old recording made in a loud restaurant. None of it was guaranteed. It just happened to go the investigation's way, eventually, one piece at a time. The legal process, even after 5 convictions, hasn't fully closed. Charlie Adelson's defense argued on appeal that pretrial media coverage made it functionally impossible to seat an impartial jury for his 2023 trial, pointing specifically to the fact that of 96 prospective jurors questioned during jury selection, 54 had already formed an opinion about his guilt before the trial had even properly begun, and of those 54, all but 1 believed he was guilty. It's a genuinely striking statistic, and on its face, an understandable argument for a defense team to make in a case that had already generated years of local and national headlines. But in a ruling dated July 1st, 2026, Florida's First District Court of Appeals rejected that argument and upheld Charlie Adelson's convictions and sentence in full, finding that the limited statements made by prospective jurors about media coverage and the discussions that had taken place informally in the jury assembly room before selection even started didn't rise to the level of proving he'd actually been denied a fair trial. State Attorney Jack Campbell, who prosecuted the case, called the ruling well decided in comments to reporters after the decision came down, describing Charlie Adelson as obviously a huge part of the crime and stating plainly that the reason he was convicted is because he is guilty. Donna Adelson has filed her own notice of appeal, a process that, as of this recording, is still working its way through the Florida court system. Given how long every other stage of this case has taken, nearly 2 years to identify the shooters, 6 more to indict Charlie, 11 total to convict Donna, there's no reason to expect her appeal will move quickly either. The public attention around this case hasn't slowed down since the final verdict either. In January 2026, ABC's 20/20th Inches aired a new episode titled Meddler or Murderer, built around fresh interviews with juror Evan Higginbotham and with Dan Markel's parents, Ruth and Phil, who spoke about their son's life outside of the case itself, the father he was, not just the victim he became. That same period saw a resurfaced 2015 podcast interview with Wendy Adelson recirculate widely, in which she described her marriage to Dan in strikingly cold terms, times, saying she had married a man I lacked passionate love for, a comment that, whatever its original context, took on a very different weight once played back against everything that followed. In May 2026, A&E premiered a new true crime documentary series called Killer Investigations, with its very first episode, Murder in Law, built entirely around this case, tracing the decade-long investigation from the crime scene at Dan's home through Donna Adelson's eventual arrest and conviction, and highlighting the specific role Markel's own brother-in-law's family connections played, ironically, in helping investigators finally break the case open years after it had gone cold. But nothing in any of these appeals, retrospectives, or new interviews changes what happened on the morning of July 18th, 2014, or what it permanently cost two little boys who will never get their father back. Dan Markel's mother, Ruth, took her grief and turned it into legislation. She worked directly with Florida lawmakers and advocates in Tallahassee to help pass what's now known as the Markel Act, a state law that allows grandparents to formally seek visitation rights when a parent has been civilly or criminally linked to the death of the child's other parent. It exists specifically because of the legal gap that left Dan fighting for access to his own sons in the first place, and it stands now as a direct, permanent response to exactly the kind of situation that got him killed. A close friend of Dan's, Jason Solomon, founded an organization called Justice for Dan, Inc. in the immediate aftermath of the murder. It grew, over the following decade, into a global following of people who never knew Dan personally but followed the case as it crawled through the courts year after year. 10 years after his death, the organization launched a scholarship in his name, giving law students the chance to continue the kind of scholarly work on punishment and justice that Dan spent his career pursuing. Benjamin and Lincoln Markel are growing up now, no longer the 5- and 3-year-olds who were dropped off at daycare on an ordinary Friday morning in July 2014, unaware that it would be the last time their father ever picked them up. Their father never got to see the people they've become. He was a great father, Ruth Markel has said in more than one interview since. That's the most important thing about Dan. With all his accomplishments, to me, I'm the proudest of him as a father. He loved those two boys. If this case left you as unsettled as it left us, a family with money and standing, a custody order treated as a problem to be eliminated rather than negotiated, and a coded word for murder hiding inside a joke told to police less than a day after the killing, that's exactly the kind of story we cover every week here on the Homicide Room. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, drop a like if you made it all the way to the end, and let us know in the comments what part of this case caught you most off guard. Was it the TV, the airport arrest, or something from the trials themselves? We read every single one. We'll see you in the next one.